Okay, so I wanted to create a video, and this will cover essentially the AI estate, broadly speaking, in the Microsoft realm. So what you're seeing over here is the MITRE Atlas threat mapping framework here. So essentially, this is a matrix made up of all the attacks you should be thinking of in adopting a large language model, right? Um, Now, additionally, it's also a safe assumption, right, that your organization perhaps already has some familiarity with ChatGPT, right? Broadly speaking, some type of chatbot. Now, most organizations, when they're adopting this type of technology in general, right, you have a couple of options from moving from the traditional subscription model, right? When we think about if you wanted to use a Copilot, um, or broadly if you wanted to use like a Google Gemini as well, right? Um, these are essentially going to be tools that are going to help with your productivity. Now, depending on the way they're implemented, the value proposition per se for a use of a Copilot up here is using stuff like RAG, right? Specifically. Now, let's say your use case is plugins or something else further, right? Let me draw your attention to, let me make sure that this comes out a lot better. When we're thinking about plugins, where it gets a little muddy per se, depending on the implementation, is all going to come down to what permissions are allowed on the API. And the reason being is because the trust boundary, specifically when we're talking M365 Copilot, right? We'll keep this in scope first as our topic, has a trust boundary. And that trust boundary essentially is where your data resides inside the service itself, right? M365. And as I erase this, I'll explain this a little bit further. So in my last video, we talked about specifically what is M365 Copilot, what are the things we need to be cognizant about if we're going to adopt an enterprise large language model software as a service offering, such as Copilot, right, which is what they represent. Now, broadly, when we think about what are the threat vectors to our estate, we can use existing frameworks that do a pretty good job, right? So just taking a look at the MITRE attack framework here, I'll start on the far left side. Reconnaissance. So there's 5 techniques, right? So when we think about, let me make sure I don't lose my mouse here. Reconnaissance. We have 5 techniques listed. So first we have search for victims' publicly available research materials. The thing about this is, let me shift up here so I can move a little bit. When we think broadly, we want to look at what does that break down to. So that's specifically someone looking for publicly searchable information where that machine learning is used from a victim organization, right? Think about this attacking the model per se. The adversary uses the information to identify targets for the attack. So knowledge of this underlying architecture to craft a more realistic, at least in the reference here, is a mitigation for this would be limiting. We want to limit release of public information, right? And broadly, when we think about confidentiality, this should already be at the forefront of most practitioners' mind, right? What is out there that A, we're unaware of, but B, do we know that it's out there? And are we tracking it, right? These are going to be some of those questions you want to answer. Now, a couple of links that I'm seeing here from the case studies talks about GP2 model replication, Microsoft Edge AI evasion, some case studies, and then mitigation specifically. When I click on mitigation, I can get a breakdown. Specifically, it talks about you can use this to then correlate areas such as search, right? Search for victims' publicly available information, essentially that reconnaissance portion. And then we want to make sure that we limit this, right? That exposure from that surface per se, right? Now, we also want to look if there is any specific sites that we do have open, restrict release of some technical information. So anything that could be proprietary, right? Think about this as IP. Broadly, this could be a number of things, right, that we want to protect. Now, we also want to ensure that if there is any sensitive metadata, when we're thinking about our recon area here, right, that we're going to limit any type of metadata associated with our model. And I'm sorry if my handwriting is not the best. I'm trying to maneuver this little tablet a little bit. These are some of those key areas. Now, this is just going through one, but broadly, what are some of the areas to break down when we're thinking about adoption broadly, right? So if we're going with the SaaS application, right? So now this goes into the decision tree. So I use decision tree. Okay. Buy or build. And that's going to be a number of conversations you will have to understand kind of the responsibilities on both ends, right? If we buy, i.e. a M365 Copilot as an example, or a Google Gemini, we're going to have to understand what are the controls that we can put in place to monitor this, right? This still will represent the SaaS approach, right? So the provider, right, in this case, this could be Google or Microsoft, is responsible for quite a lot of the underlying infrastructure per se, right? Let me scroll down a little bit. Responsible. A bulk of configurations, right? So when we think back to our shared responsibility model, this is going to encompass these items here, right? Now, it's likely when we think about extending those, right? Perhaps we have a, and I'm just jotting down over here, perhaps we have a Salesforce, right? Perhaps our organization has an ADP. Perhaps we have an SAP, things like that. Now, this is where the term plugins, or you'll hear this a lot, right? Now, you want to think about this as an area that you want to focus on explicitly because of the information is likely sensitive, right? Our Salesforce might have CRM data, right? Our HR might have sensitive information as well, right? So we want to make sure what is explicitly accessed. There is a choke point, right? Here, choke point. But B, what are the exact permissions that will be enabled here, right? Now, the permissions as well, we want to ensure that these are logged somewhere, right, for those plugins to work accordingly. Now, the reason I'm covering this is because this is likely conversations you're already having, hopefully, right? Because long-term, if you make this decision, right, from the SaaS offering, you're going to have to consider what are the support of those plugins. Now, the reason why you see my nice little photo over here of Azure, right, the delineation is you have, and let me make sure I can get enough space here. I'll need to do enough to abstract it so I don't mess with any of the visuals. Okay, so Azure has its AI Studio, right? Now, the reason I'm bringing up Azure's AI Studio, and I'm sorry that this is looking tacky here, let me do some erasing. Is because when we're going to an IaaS provider, whether that's Azure, GCP, right? This could be a number of areas. This could be GCP as well. We have multiple models that we can use. So instead of just being limited to GPT-4, that is predominantly relied on for some of the Copilot stuff, right? You can use tools like Meta's Ollama, right? You could use NVIDIA's models. You could use Mistral. You can use a number. And the reason I bring this up is because if we want to build the more customizable large language model, right, this is going to live in Azure specifically. The reason being is due to that customization, we offer, or Microsoft offers, a API as a service per se. Now, I'll show you what this looks like in the studio, but the reason I'm making this conversation relevant to the larger context is if you're thinking about perhaps I want my own GPT, my own model, right? Perhaps you don't want it to use GPT, similar to how ChatGPT now or OpenAI allows you to create your own GPT advisor or GPT with low code, no code, right? That won't be this platform. Okay, so I just want to demystify that. Now, going back, we're going to have to bring this into the fold here because this Copilot, right, is going to be the SaaS offering and is going to be a licensed product, right? Now, let's say you still want to do some of the customization or creating your own model, but perhaps you don't have the technical people on staff, or whatever the reason, maybe you want what I call a path of least resistance, right? The reason I say that is there's a number of ways you can look at tech. You can look at, it can be done. There's just a path of least resistance, whether it's a turnkey or there's going to be complexity, right? Customization. And the reason why we say this is because you can use Copilot Studio, right? And what Copilot Studio is, it's a separate offering. This used to be previously Power Virtual Apps platform. It's essentially been rebranded or reconfigured per se. This will allow you to have that low code, no code creation. Now, separate licensing, right? This will be upwards of, I believe it's $200 per seat. But the difference is here, you wouldn't have to essentially license your entire enterprise. What you could do is build a GPT from that area, right? And then think about, okay, now we want to leverage this a little bit further. Sorry, I lost my cursor for a second. So that's me finding there. So that's going to be some of those decisions you're going to think about. Now, both of these have implications when we're thinking about the security aspect, right? For the SaaS adoption, we're going to predominantly focus on what type of data is being accessed, right? So we've put together quite a lot of, there's documentation broadly, but a lot of it is more abstract, right? High level. So when we think about the operation sides of it and getting to what I call where the rubber meets the road per se, you're going to have to consider a couple things, right? Broadly, as data is now more or less a first-class citizen, as they say, right? Data represents a large subset of your organization's architecture in some shape or form, right? Data could be broadly in RDS, right? This could be NoSQL. This could be, depending where your data resides, right? When we're thinking about our customer data, right? Or when we're thinking about personal files, right? What are those permissions? Do we have a centralized storage system, right? And what are the protections that we're going to enforce, right? Now, broadly, the way I've seen this, at least for SaaS offerings, is most of this is going to fall into metadata protections. Now, what does that mean, right? So metadata protections broadly, you want to think about for our applications that do have any type of data going back and forth, right? Data in transit, data at rest, etc. Are we enforcing protections on the metadata, right? Now, what that means explicitly is, do we have a data taxonomy broadly defined for the organization? And let's say you don't, right? Okay, no judgment. These are the things that we should be thinking about broadly, right? We should be considering how does that really play out. So a number of things you want to start with. I don't know, right, what I can't protect without having some type of knowledge, right? Or without some type of inventory, okay? So first we need to assess, where is our data at, right? And then first, is it sensitive? If this were to leak to the New York Times, is it having something that is sensitive to our business practice, right, broadly? And the reason I say that is because a lot of organizations broadly might have multiple systems of storing their data, whether that's a OneDrive for business, whether that's a box.com, just depending on your needs, right? Now, each type of underlying SaaS platform per se, right? Some of these have, where is, losing my pointer again. SaaS data should have some level of protection natively. And I'm sorry for the mix up there. Natively, you want to think about sensitivity labels at the highest level, right? And these are typically a label that's going to be applied at the metadata for that file. Now, specifically in M365, these are going to have protections for those files. Now, a number one question I'll always get is specifically, okay, well, what can be bypassed? And specifically for threat modeling, we need to think about bypass, right? So if the data itself is being crawled, right, and in this case, most of the time it's going to be indexed. That index is typically represented in what is known as vector databases. I won't go down that rabbit hole in this conversation, but just so you're aware, right? Now, this index is going to be retrieved, right, through whichever the case may be. Let's say my prompt states a specific file as a reference point, and it resides, or that data has already been crawled, then it's going to use a form of retrieval augmented generation to then get that. Now, when we're thinking about bypassing, right, we need to think about what are the protections we can put in place. So typically for this visibility, we're going to want to rely on our CASB a lot more. And the reason being is the user activity protections, right? Is the user downloading, uploading? How are they interacting with said SaaS applications, assuming we have visibility, right? Again, this is making those assumptions that we do have that visibility. Now, we also need to know that the existing, depending on your implementation, from the SaaS perspective, right? We're still talking in the confines of M365. We're going to need to make decisions about specific areas that we consider are off limits per se, right? What are our guardrails? Most of the time, this can be accomplished in multiple ways, but broadly this can be known as communications compliance. And if you aren't aware of this, this would be a good time to be aware of this. Now, you likely have some form of a doctrine per se for each standard operating procedures of a business, right? Now this could be code of conducts, right? When we think about broadly. If you're in the financial sector, you can't do some type of insider trading, whatever the case may be, right? We know of some form of rules that govern our use. What communications compliance does is allow us to depict what are those guardrails, right? Let's say broadly this could be stock manipulation or perhaps harassment of another individual, right? This is going to look if inside our chats, right, accessing M365 Copilot, right, if something were to occur, how can it be detected, right? And what are those detection mechanisms here? So we're up here, right? And we want to think about broadly down here. Now, we could have this well-defined beforehand or learn as we go. I would rather go with have this defined beforehand, okay? Now, some of the areas you're going to Okay, so switching gears, I didn't want to go too abstract. Now I'm going to show you some areas for the infrastructure as a service offering, right? So when we think about control of creating our own large language model, however, what idea we concoct or come up with, ideate, right? It's likely going to deal with some customization. And the reason I'm showing this is because those are some of those decisions you'll have to consider broadly, right? So if we're seeing here specifically a Azure AI Studio that's in preview that I have launched up right now, we can see specifically I can look at a number of models. So when we're referring back to our whiteboard session, right, this is essentially looking at, well, perhaps GPT-4 is not really my intention. Maybe I want something different, right? So you can see Meta AI has quite a lot of LLMs to use. Mistral as well is well known in this space, and then you also have NVIDIA, I believe Databricks as well. There's quite a lot. Salesforce is in here. So you have Hugging Face, pretty known for that, and then we also have some others. So you can essentially have the pick of the litter, per se, for your model catalog. Now, I'll draw your attention to the model benchmarks, right? And you can specifically compare your LLMs broadly, right, together and see what's kind of the difference. So let's look at Code Llama, I know specifically. Let's look at Python, but let's just look at what's the difference between these two. So if I go back specifically, if I'm trying to evaluate from a decision standpoint, right, I can look at the model accuracy. So it looks like on average I have 39.64, and then for Code Llama I have a drastically lower average, right, for that area that I'm seeking. Now you can see here, this will tell you groundedness, fluency, relevance, GPT similarity, etc., right? So it only has accuracy listed for this. But now let's say I wanted to look at GPT-4, and let's look at these two. So two different models, right? So we can see the large difference that will happen predominantly with the way that these models are given. Now, again, this is not really a fair comparison, okay? Two different, each model has a purpose, right? You want to think broadly. Code Llama is going to be for coding. GPT-4 is going to be a broad LLM, okay, with a lot of testing. So just to keep us centered here. Now, additionally, when we think about the prompt catalog, right, think about this as a library of specific catalogs for a common use case, right? So we can see here we have our property listing video, an insurance report, a number of things. And you can see they've kind of categorized this as well for task, industries, modalities as well. Now, that's the explore section, right? So now when we think about manage it, if we go to manage, we can look at our specific projects. And to interact with Azure AI Studio, you have to essentially have a project. As you can see here, I deleted one. Be careful with these projects because they can and will add up. Okay, so I'm just showing this portion here. Now I'm gonna switch over, and I'm gonna show specifically a area that you want to consider. I'm gonna open this in a new tab real quick. And I'm going to show you how you would enforce some of those safeguards and some of those controls on your own model, right? And the reason I'm covering this is because there's a lot of velocity, like anything in technology, right? Consume, right? And I don't want it to be lost in the translation as part of, okay, well, what else can we do to govern, right? How can we protect our organization from any types of attacks, but broadly speaking, what changes the paradigm with large language models, right? So I'm going into a portal now. Let me redo. Let's see here. Let me switch gears. So let me copy this link over, and I'll just paste it inside our dashboard so I don't have to switch visuals. So we can see the domain changes to OpenAI. Now, OpenAI Studio is a predecessor before Azure AI Studio, so if you've been using this for quite some time, this should look a little bit more familiar. So when I go to my deployments, right, and again, this is managing my deployments for GPT-3, and I have about 4 deployments here, GPT-4, right? So it'll tell you when they've been provisioned, right, and then when the model itself will be deprecated, per se. This will tell you your rate limits, right, when's the last time it's been updated, etc. Now, if I go to my models broadly, right, I can see that these are going to encompass all of Azure OpenAI, okay? You won't see Llama in here, right? That's going to be in the Azure AI Studio. But specifically when I look at content filters, and again, this is in preview, I can create customized content filters, right, based on those safeguards. So let's say I want a specific threshold to hate, for categories of hate. Let's say I want that high for prompt, right? You can see the difference between prompt and completion. So this gives you a good example of, when you want to allow certain things or block, right, outright, and the guardrails behind that. Now, let's just say I went with that. I can also hit enable, right? Annotate specifically content safety, right? As allow an AI model to detect jailbreak attempts, right? So if anyone tries to bypass, essentially a safeguard, right? I can also do protected material, right? So if there's specific intellectual property that we don't want to the public, right, in some shape or form, you can define what that protected parameter is, right? And then protected material code, right? Think about the source code specifically. Let's go to that. And now I can add a block list, right? So think about the block list being, I have profanity and filter response. Now, block lists are going to be able to allow you to bring in stuff that you want blocked, right? Think about this as a schema per se. So I'm just going to go with the defaults here, and then we can do streaming mode, default or asynchronous. This tells you asynchronous modified filter content runs are asynchronous, and completions will stream back token by token with a delayed content filtering signal. So essentially, when the prompt comes back to you, it's going to go token by token asynchronously with that content filtering happening. Okay. Now you can see here, once I hit this specifically, I will create. I'm not going to actually create this, but just to show you what that experience would look like, right? Now for the block list, I can create a block list, right? I can say, whatever the case may be, let's say source code as an example. I can hit create, and then once I hit create, I can go in here, and then I can add specific terms, right? Particularly, this is going to rely on regex, right? So if regex is well beyond your pale, no worries. I'm just showing you what are some of those anticipations. Now the tokens things will come up, right, as you're testing any of these. And if you can see, I'm in East US, depending on your region. Your token limit per se will be displayed here, and then you can obviously request an elevated quota, right? Some of these are mostly used for testing, right? So you can see, obviously, the higher the model, you want to think about the compute on the back end that is being served that, it needs to be well aware of what that demand looks like, okay? Similarly, once you have a model, then you essentially create a deployment, right? And that deployment essentially represents your single instant use of this specific model, right? That I can query with an API key, etc., and then build that into whatever the product is. These playgrounds specifically, I think it's a good area to get your feet wet, because this will play into some of the design decisions when you are creating your own custom large language model, or perhaps bot, right? And if you can see here, the customization will go into probabilities. There's a number of ways you can do this programmatically as well, so I don't want you to feel limited. But let's say you're not necessarily high on using code in terms of the technical complexities associated with that, right? Or like that's not your forte. This will be a user interface you can use. Now you can see here, I can go with an example, translate text, right, and generate it. This will procreate what those tokens are, okay? So just as an FYI. So hopefully, after this, you're at least a little bit more aware. I know we're just touching the surface, but I wanted to demystify back to our whiteboard, right? What are those key differences specifically related to if we are going to make a design decision, right? Regardless if that's M365 Copilot or another product. That's not to keep it product. I want to stay agnostic, right? What do we need to be aware of? What can we do to get more out of our large language model, right? That's going to be really aligned with those plugins and making sure we govern those permissions as well. But then also, what are the guardrails we're going to put in place on our data, right? So data becomes a focal point, data access control specifically. Now, the differentiator of getting a product that's already kind of baked into your ecosystem, i.e. M365 Copilot, is a lot of those protections that you already have from M365, if configured correctly, right? This makes the assumption you're already monitoring your SharePoint sites, your Teams, your OneDrives, etc., right? That same level of protection and that same nuance of familiarity is going to be baked into that SaaS offering. And I'm pretty sure this is going to follow with Google Gemini as well. I know that's still in preview. I'm going to post a video using Google Gemini to kind of show you the key differentiators as well, but also make you aware of what those design decisions look like in Azure and beyond, okay? And we'll cover more on the large language model as far as Atlas is concerned. I'll give a bunch of resources when we're thinking about threat mapping and threat modeling, broadly building our AI systems, right? So hopefully this video helped out. Feel free to share this with colleagues, subscribe, and let me know if this content interests you further.